Get off her! The yell ripped through the dawn quiet, but it was too late. 3 men held her down. Another raised a branding iron. The smell of burning hair already choked the air. Shouldn't have stopped. Should have kept riding. That's what any sane man would do. But something in the girl's defiant glare, even as pain twisted her face, it snagged in his gut. They think they're punishing her, see? Think they're teaching her a lesson about stealing. They have no idea that her quiet kindness is about to turn this whole world upside down. They don't know it, but he knows. The pity is, neither does she. When he checked for breath, both women's eyes snapped open simultaneously, black and piercing, filled with a wildness that made his hand freeze above his sidearm. The older one's fingers were already wrapped around a broken blade, trembling but ready. The younger one whispered something in Apache, a language he didn't speak, but somehow understood as a warning. He raised his palm slowly, showing he carried no threat. But the real danger wasn't in that moment. It was in what he couldn't see coming, that saving them would mean losing a part of himself he didn't know he'd have to choose. 3 days before, Boone had been alone, and that was exactly how he preferred it. The ranch where he worked sat 15 miles from the nearest settlement, a collection of weathered buildings surrounded by nothing but scrubland and silence. The owner rarely visited, leaving Boone to maintain the property and the small herd of cattle that somehow survived on sparse grass and stubbornness. It was simple work, predictable, safe from the complications that people always brought. But fate had other plans, and they arrived bleeding in the dirt. The older one never lowered that broken blade, not even when her arm started shaking from exhaustion. Her face was angular, beautiful in a severe way, with blood dried across her cheekbone and temple. The younger sister lay partially behind her, one hand gripping the older one's clothing, her breathing shallow and labored. A gash ran across her shoulder, deep enough that Boone could see it needed immediate attention, or infection would claim her within days. He spoke slowly, keeping his movements minimal. The words didn't matter as much as the tone. Non-threatening. Patient, he gestured to his horse to the canteen hanging from the saddle, then to the wound on the younger sister's shoulder. The older one's eyes tracked every movement, calculating, weighing risk against necessity. Finally, she lowered the blade half an inch. It wasn't trust. It was desperation masked as tactical decision. Boone approached with the canteen, kneeling 6 feet away and sliding it across the dirt. The older sister snatched it with her free hand, never taking her eyes off him, and helped the younger one drink. The water seemed to revive something in both of them. The younger sister's eyes focused more clearly, studying Boone with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. There was something different in her gaze compared to her sister's. Where the older one showed suspicion and survival instinct, the younger showed curiosity beneath the pain. He pointed to himself. Boone. The older sister said nothing, her jaw set firm, but the younger one whispered, her voice rough from thirst. Ka. She touched her sister's arm, then placed her hand on her own chest. Ayana. The names hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge across a canyon of cultural divide and circumstance. Boone gestured to the sun, now climbing higher, then to the shade of the rocky outcrop 30 yards away. Moving them even that far would be a challenge. Getting them back to the ranch would be nearly impossible without cooperation. He stood slowly, showing empty hands, and walked to his horse. When he returned, he carried a blanket and strips of cloth he'd torn from an old shirt. Ka watched him approach with renewed tension, but Ayana spoke to her in Apache, a series of soft sounds that seemed to ease something in the older sister's posture. Not much, but enough. Boone knelt again, this time closer, and carefully began to wrap Ayana's shoulder wound. His hands worked with practiced efficiency from years of tending injured cattle and horses. Kaya's blade remained pointed at his ribs the entire time, close enough that one wrong move would end the gesture of help permanently. As he tied off the bandage, his fingers brushed against Ayana's collarbone, and he felt her sharp intake of breath. When he glanced up, her eyes were locked on his face with an expression he couldn't quite read. It lasted only a second before she looked away, but something had shifted in that moment. Something neither of them could name yet. The ride back to the ranch took 4 hours. Ka sat behind Boone on the horse, her body rigid with distrust. One arm wrapped around Ayanna, who sat in front, half conscious and leaning against Boone's chest. He could feel Kaz breathing against his back, controlled and measured. The breathing of someone ready to react to any threat. But he could also feel Ayanna's weight against him, vulnerable and trusting in a way that made his chest tighten with an unfamiliar responsibility. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was merciless overhead. Boone helped them into the small cabin he used for storage, which had a cot and enough space to lay out bedrolls on the floor. Ka immediately positioned herself between Ayanna and the door, her body language clear. She was the guardian, and he was still a potential threat. He brought water, dried meat, clean cloth for bandages, and then stepped outside to give them space. That night, lying in his own quarters across the yard, Boone stared at the ceiling and wondered what he just brought into his carefully ordered solitude. He'd seen the way Ayanna had looked at him during the ride. He'd felt the tension in Ka's protective stance. These weren't just two people in need of temporary shelter. They were something more complicated, something that was already beginning to shift the ground beneath everything he thought he understood about his life. He didn't know it yet, but in bringing them here, he'd set something in motion that couldn't be stopped, something that would force all three of them to confront desires they'd been taught to suppress, choices they'd been trained to avoid, and a truth that would test the bonds of blood and honor. Because in 3 weeks, both sisters would be standing before him, healthy and strong, each silently demanding an answer to a question he hadn't known they were asking, and he would have to choose. But only one could stay. The first week passed in careful distance. Boone brought food and fresh water twice daily, leaving supplies outside the cabin door and retreating before Ka could interpret his presence as a threat. Each time he noticed small changes. The bowls returned cleaner. The bandages he left were used properly. Ayanna's fever broke on the 4th day, and he could hear the sisters talking in low voices through the wooden walls. Their language a melody of sounds he couldn't decipher, but somehow found himself wanting to understand. On the 8th morning, he found Ka standing outside the cabin, testing her weight on both legs. The wound on her thigh had been worse than he'd initially seen, masked by dried blood and dirt. She'd hidden the severity from him, unwilling to show vulnerability. Now she stood in the early light, her jaw set against obvious pain, refusing to limp, even though he could see the muscles in her leg trembling with effort. Their eyes met across the yard. She didn't look away this time, and neither did he. There was a challenge in her gaze, daring him to comment on her struggle. To offer help she would certainly refuse. Instead, he simply nodded once, an acknowledgement between two stubborn people who understood the price of independence. Something flickered across her face, too brief to name, before she turned and walked back inside with measured, painful steps. That afternoon, Ayanna appeared at the cabin door. She moved with more ease than her sister, the shoulder wound healing cleanly under the careful attentions Kaya had given it. Boone was repairing a section of fence when he noticed her watching him from 40 ft away. She didn't approach, just stood there with one hand against the doorframe, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, catching copper highlights in the sun he hadn't noticed before. He straightened slowly, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the space between buildings. Then Ayanna did something unexpected. She smiled, not broadly, not with any suggestion of ease or familiarity, but a small, genuine curve of her lips that transformed her entire face from merely beautiful to something that made Boone's chest constrict painfully. He found himself taking 3 steps toward her before his mind caught up with his body. She didn't retreat, didn't show alarm, just watched him approach with that same intense curiosity he'd seen when he first bandaged her wound. When he stopped, still maintaining respectful distance, she spoke in halting English. "Thank you." The words were careful, practiced, each syllable pronounced with concentration. "You save us." Boone's throat felt tight. "You're welcome." "Why?" The question came softer, more complex than the simple word suggested. Her eyes searched his face as if the answer might be written there in lines and shadows. He didn't have a good answer, not one that made sense even to himself. So he told the truth. Couldn't ride past. Ayanna tilted her head slightly considering this. Then she said something that would echo in his mind for weeks to come. Ka says, "You are dangerous, not because you hurt us, because you make us want to stay." Before he could respond, Ka's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding, and Apache. Ayana's expression shifted, becoming more guarded, and she turned back toward the cabin. But just before she disappeared inside, she glanced over her shoulder one more time, and Boone saw something in that look that terrified him more than any broken blade ever could. It was hope, raw, vulnerable, and directed entirely at him. That night, lying awake again, Boone forced himself to confront the reality he'd been avoiding. They needed to leave soon. Their wounds were healing. They were Apache women in a world that wouldn't treat them kindly. But they'd survive before he found them, and they'd survive after. The logical thing, the safe thing, was to help them get supplies and send them on their way before whatever was building between these walls became something none of them could walk away from. But when he closed his eyes, he saw Ayana's smile. And worse, he saw Ka's brief, unguarded moment of respect when she thought he wasn't looking. Two sisters, each reaching toward him in completely different ways. Each offering something he hadn't known he needed until it was standing in his yard, challenging every wall he'd built around his solitary life. He was in trouble. Deep, complicated, impossible trouble. And the worst part was, he didn't want to fix it. By the second week, the invisible boundaries began to dissolve. Ka started helping with the horses, her movement still stiff but determined. She had a natural way with the animals that surprised Boone, gentling even the most temperamental mare with soft sounds and patient hands. She never asked permission, simply appeared at the corral one morning and began working alongside him in silence. The lack of conversation didn't feel awkward. It felt like understanding. Ayana took to caring for the vegetable garden behind the main house, a patch of earth Boone had neglected for months. She worked in the early mornings when the air was still cool, her fingers coaxing life from plants he'd assumed were dead. Sometimes he watched her from the porch, coffee growing cold in his hand. Mesmerized by the concentrated grace of her movements, she caught him staring more than once. And each time that small smile would appear, private and knowing, the tension between the sisters became more apparent as their strength returned. Boone noticed the way Ka's jaw would tighten when Ayana lingered too long in conversation with him. He saw how Ayana's eyes would dim when Kaya and he worked together in the corral. Their partnership wordless and efficient. They never argued openly, but the air between them grew heavy with unspoken conflict. On the 13th day, everything shifted. A rider approached the ranch just after noon. A weathered man Boone recognized as Fletcher Knox, who owned the neighboring property 12 Minot East. Boone met him at the edge of the yard, aware of Kaya and Ayana watching from the cabin doorway. Fletcher's eyes moved past Boone to the sisters, his expression hardening. Those Apache women. Boone kept his voice level. They needed help. Help! Fletcher spat into the dust. You know what happened at the Whitmore place last month? Raiding party took everything. Burned what they couldn't carry. People around here don't take kindly to Apache. Helpful or not, these women aren't a raiding party. You don't know that. Fletcher leaned forward in his saddle, lowering his voice. Listen, Carter, I don't care what you do on your own land, but word's spreading. You keep them here much longer. You're going to have bigger problems than I can help with. After Fletcher rode off, Boone stood in the yard, feeling the weight of what was coming. He'd been naive to think they could exist in this isolated bubble indefinitely. The world was pressing in, and it wouldn't be gentle. That evening, Ka approached him as he sat on the porch. She stood at the bottom step, her posture rigid with pride, even as she spoke words that clearly cost her. We should leave. Where would you go? Anywhere that doesn't bring trouble to you. Boone studied her face, seeing the conflict there. Is that what you want? Something cracked in her careful expression. What I want doesn't matter. What is safe matters. Maybe I don't want safe. The words hung between them, charged with meaning neither was ready to fully acknowledge. Ka's hands clenched at her sides, and for a moment, Boone thought she might say something that would change everything, but footsteps sounded behind him, and Ayana appeared in the doorway. Ka! Her voice was soft but firm. Come inside. The older sister's eyes flicked between Boone and Ayana. and something like pain crossed her features before she turned and walked away. Ayana remained in the doorway, backlit by lamplight, her expression unreadable. "She is trying to protect everyone," Ayana said quietly, including herself. "From what?" "From wanting something she thinks she cannot have." Ayana stepped closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "She is not the only one who wants it." Before Boone could respond, Ayana retreated inside, leaving him alone with the terrible understanding of what she'd just confessed. Both sisters. The reality crashed over him like cold water. He'd suspected felt the currents running beneath their interactions, but having it spoken aloud made it undeniable. He sat there long after dark, listening to the low voices of the sisters arguing inside the cabin. He couldn't understand the words, but he heard the emotion, the rising tension, the barely controlled anger and hurt. When silence finally fell, it felt more ominous than the argument. Boone knew with absolute certainty that something would break soon. The pressure building in this small space between three people was unsustainable, and when it broke, someone would get hurt in ways that no bandage could heal. The breaking point came 3 days later, under circumstances no one anticipated. Boone was in the barn repairing a saddle when he heard raised voices outside. Not the controlled, tense conversations he'd grown accustomed to, but genuine anger. He stepped into the sunlight to find Kaya and Ayana facing each other in the yard, their argument fierce and rapid in Apache. Ayana's face was flushed, her hands gesturing sharply. Ka stood rigid, her expression carved from stone, but her eyes blazed with barely contained emotion. When Ayana stepped forward, closing the distance between them, Ka's hands shot out and gripped her sister's arm hard enough to make the younger woman wince. Boone moved without thinking, crossing the space between them. "That's enough." Both sisters turned to him, their faces showing mirror images of frustration and pain. Kaya released Ayana's arm but didn't step back. When she spoke, her English was rougher than usual, strained by emotion. "You want to know what we fight about? We fight about you," she gestured sharply at him. "My sister thinks she has claim because you are gentle with her, because she makes you smile, because she is younger and softer and everything a man wants." Ayana's voice cut through, equally raw. "And you think you have claim because you are strong, because you work beside him like a partner, because you believe love must be earned through struggle, never given freely." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire neither could extinguish. Boone felt the weight of their gazes, both demanding and accusing, asking him to solve a problem he didn't know how to approach. "This isn't right," he said quietly. "Your sisters?" "Yes," Kaya replied, her voice breaking slightly. "We are sisters. We have survived everything together. Our family's death, starvation, men who wanted to hurt us. We survived because we had each other. And now we are being destroyed by something that should not divide us." Ayana's eyes glistened. "I did not choose this. I did not wake up and decide to want something my sister wants. But I cannot make it stop." "Can you make your heart stop wanting what it wants?" The question was directed at Boone, and he had no answer that wouldn't wound one of them. The truth was, he couldn't. His heart had become a traitor to his carefully ordered life, pulled in two directions by two remarkable women who deserved better than this impossible situation. "In our culture," Kaya said, her voice steadier now, "there was a way to resolve this. When two women wanted the same man, they would compete, not with words or tears, but with proof of who could be the better wife, the better partner. The man would watch and choose based on action, not empty promises." "That's not my culture," Boone said carefully, "but you must choose anyway." Ayana's voice was soft but firm. "We cannot continue like this. The three of us trapped in this small space, pretending the future is not coming. Fletcher was right. We must leave soon, but before we do, you must decide." "Decide what?" Kaya stepped forward, her posture commanding despite the vulnerability in her eyes. "Which one of us stays with you? Which one of us becomes your wife? Because we cannot both remain, and we will not leave you wondering what might have been. You saved our lives. Now you must choose which life you want beside yours." The directness of it stunned him. No games, no manipulation, just brutal honesty that demanded equal honesty in return. Boone looked between them, seeing not just the surface attraction, but the depth beneath. Ka, fierce and loyal, who would stand beside him through any storm. Ayana, gentle and perceptive, who would bring light to the dark corners of his guarded heart. I need time, he managed. 3 days, Ka said. In 3 days, Fletcher will return. He told you he would check back, and he will bring others if we are still here. We must have an answer before then. One of us will stay and become your wife. The other will take supplies and leave before trouble finds us all. Ayana added softly. And whoever you do not choose will accept it with honor. We made this promise to each other last night. No matter how much it hurts, the sister you do not choose will leave with dignity and without resentment. But Boone could see the lie in that promise. However well-intentioned, resentment might not come, but pain would. And the bond between these sisters, already strained to breaking, might never fully heal, regardless of his choice. He had 3 days to make a decision that would alter 3 lives forever. 3 days to choose between 2 women he had no right to care for, but couldn't imagine losing. 3 days before everything changed. The first day of the 3 passed in careful observation. Kai awoke before dawn and worked alongside Boone as she had for the past week. But now every action carried weight. She showed him how to gentle the most skittish horse using techniques from her people. Her hands sure and her voice low. When the mare finally allowed Boone to approach without shying, Kai's eyes met his with quiet satisfaction. This is what I offer, her expression said. Partnership built on respect and skill. Ayana spent the morning transforming the neglected garden into something beautiful. But more than that, she prepared a meal using wild plants she'd gathered from around the property. Plants Boone had walked past 100 times without knowing they were edible. She set the food before him at midday with no words, just a gentle touch on his shoulder as she passed. This is what I offer, the gesture whispered. Care and knowledge that makes a house a home. That evening, both sisters sat on the porch steps, while Boone worked on repairing the barn door. They didn't speak to each other, but they didn't need to. Their presence together was its own message. We are a unit, they seemed to say. Choosing one means understanding what you take from the other. The second day brought unexpected complexity. A widow from the settlement 8 miles south arrived seeking help with a broken wagon wheel. Her name was Margaret, and she eyed the Apache women with undisguised suspicion. While Boone worked on her wagon, Margaret spoke loudly about the dangers of harboring strangers, especially those whose people had brought violence to the territory. Ka stood perfectly still during the woman's speech, her face revealing nothing. But Boone saw the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor in her clenched hands. This was the reality they would face if she stayed. Constant judgment, endless suspicion, a life spent proving she deserved to exist in a world that wanted her gone. After Margaret left, Kaya found Boone alone. You understand now, she said simply. If you choose me, your life becomes harder. People will talk. Some will refuse to do business with you. You will be the man who married an Apache woman, and that label will follow you everywhere. I know. And still you consider it. He looked at her directly. Yes. Something shifted in her expression. A crack in her armor wide enough to glimpse the vulnerable woman beneath the warrior's facade. She reached out slowly, giving him time to move away if he wanted. When he didn't, her palm rested briefly against his chest, directly over his heart. The touch lasted only seconds, but its intimacy exceeded any kiss. Later that afternoon, Ayana asked him to walk with her to check the property's water source. They moved in comfortable silence until they reached the small spring that fed the ranch's well. She knelt beside the water, trailing her fingers through the current. Ka is stronger than me, she said without preamble. She can work harder, fight better, survive anything. I know this strength comes in different forms. Ayana looked up at him, the setting sun catching gold in her dark eyes. When you found us, I was ready to die. Not from my wounds, but from inside. We had lost everything, our family, our home, our future. Kaya kept us alive through will and anger, but I was drowning in grief. She stood slowly. Then you came, and for the first time in months, I felt something other than sorrow. You made me want to live again, not just survive. The confession was delivered simply without manipulation or plea, just truth offered like a gift he could accept or refuse. When she started to walk past him back toward the ranch, Boone caught her hand. She stopped, her breath catching audibly. Ayana. Her name felt significant on his tongue, weighted with meaning he couldn't fully articulate. She turned back and they stood there in the fading light, hands connected, the space between them charged with possibility and impossibility in equal measure. He saw tears gathering in her eyes. Even as she smiled that small, transformative smile he'd come to recognize as uniquely hers. "Whatever you choose tomorrow," she whispered, "know that you gave me back my life. That matters more than what comes after." But they both knew that was only partly true. What came after would matter immensely, would shape the rest of their lives in ways neither could fully predict. As they walked back to the ranch in silence, Boone felt the weight of tomorrow pressing down on his shoulders like physical force. One more day, then he would have to choose. The third day arrived with heavy clouds threatening rain. Boone woke before sunrise, knowing he'd barely slept. He'd spent the night weighing every conversation, every shared glance, every moment that had led him to this impossible choice. His mind kept circling the same truth. Both women deserved more than being second choice in a decision forced by circumstance. He found Ka already awake, sitting on the porch steps, watching the eastern horizon lighten. She didn't turn when he sat beside her, maintaining a respectful distance between them. "Have you decided?" Her voice was steady, but he heard the tension beneath. "I have," she nodded slowly, her jaw working as if physically holding back words. Finally, she spoke. "Before you tell me, I need to say something. Last night, Ayana and I talked for hours. We spoke truth that sisters should have spoken long ago." She turned to face him, and he was startled to see her eyes were red, though no tears fell. "I have spent my life being strong because I had to be. After our family died, strength was the only thing between us and destruction. I became hard because soft things don't survive. Ka, let me finish." She took a shaky breath. "Ayana told me that she sees in you a gentleness that calls to something in her she thought was dead. She said, you look at her like she is valuable, not for what she can do, but for who she is." Kaya's hands clenched in her lap. "And I realize that I have been trying to earn your choice through usefulness, through proving I can work beside you, survive beside you, but that is not love. That is partnership built on function, not feeling." Boone felt his throat tighten. "You think I don't feel anything for you? I think you respect me, admire me perhaps. But when you look at my sister, your face changes. Your whole body changes. You soften in a way you never do with me." She finally looked directly at him, and the pain in her eyes was devastating. "I have been competing for something I already lost, not to her, but to the truth of where your heart lives." Before Boone could respond, Ayana emerged from the cabin. She moved slowly, as if approaching something fragile that might shatter. When she reached the porch, she looked between them, reading the situation with that perceptive way she had. "You told him," she said softly to Ka. "I told him the truth. Something I should have admitted days ago instead of fighting against what I already knew." Kaya stood, brushing off her clothes with deliberate movements. She looked at Boone one last time. "I release you from having to say the words, 'I know your choice, and I accept it.'" "Ka, wait." Ayana reached for her sister, but Ka stepped back, shaking her head. "No, this is right. You and we will speak later. But first he needs to say to you what he cannot say to me. I will not stand here and watch it. I love you both too much for that." She walked toward the barn with that measured stride that revealed her limp was still present, her pride still intact despite the pain. Ayana turned to Boone, her eyes searching his face. "Is it true what my sister said?" Boone stood, closing some of the distance between them. "I didn't want this. Didn't want to have to choose between two people who both deserve everything. But yes, when I look at you, something happens that I can't control, can't explain. It terrifies me because I've spent years avoiding exactly this kind of feeling." "Why did you avoid it?" "Because feeling means risk, means vulnerability, means the possibility of loss." He took another step closer. "But you were right about what you said at the spring. You made me want to live, not just survive. And I didn't even realize I'd been doing only one of those things until you showed me the difference." Ayana's breath caught and tears finally spilled down her cheeks. "I am not strong like Ka. I cannot promise I will never break or need you or become burden. Stop. Boone reached out, gently wiping tears from her face with his thumb. Strength isn't just about surviving the worst. It's about remaining open enough to feel deeply even after loss tries to close you off. You have that strength, and it's the kind I need. She closed the remaining distance between them, resting her forehead against his chest. His arms came around her naturally, as if they'd held her 1,000 times before. They stood like that for long moments, finding comfort and closeness. Neither had to justify or earn. But even in that moment of connection, Boone's eyes drifted toward the barn where Ka had disappeared. The choice was made, but its cost was evident in the absence of the woman who'd accepted defeat with more grace than he deserved. Fletcher arrived just after noon with 3 other men as promised. Boone met them at the edge of the property, aware of both sisters watching from the porch. The men studied the women with expressions ranging from suspicion to outright hostility. You made a decision then, Fletcher observed, his eyes moving between Boone and the sisters. I have. Which one stays? Boone felt anger flash through him at the casual way Fletcher asked, as if discussing livestock rather than human lives. That's not your concern. It is if it affects whether we have problems. One of the other men, a scarred veteran named Curtis, spoke up. Apache women bring attention, the kind we don't need around here. One Apache woman, Boone corrected. One is leaving today. He saw Ka stand straighter on the porch, her posture dignified despite what that statement meant for her future. Ayana remained seated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face pale. Fletcher considered this, then nodded slowly. All right, one can be managed. You marry her proper. Make her your legal wife. Give her your name. That makes her your responsibility in the eyes of the law and the community. They give you trouble. They give us all trouble. When? Curtis demanded. Soon as we can arrange it. The men exchanged looks. Then Fletcher spoke again. There's a traveling preacher comes through every few weeks. He's due back in 5 days. You bring her to town. We'll witness the ceremony. Make it official. Until then, she stays here. And the other one leaves today. Those are the terms. Boone wanted to argue to tell them they had no right to set terms on his life. But he also knew Fletcher was offering a compromise that kept everyone safer than the alternatives. Agreed. After the men rode off, Boone returned to the porch where both sisters waited. Kaya spoke first, her voice controlled. I heard 5 days until you marry. She looked at Ayana. That gives us time. Time for what? Ayana asked softly. To do this right, to honor what we have been to each other, even as we prepare to separate. Kaya's voice cracked slightly on the last word, but she pushed forward. I will not leave in anger or shame. I will help prepare you for marriage. I will leave knowing my sister is cared for by a man who truly values her. The next 4 days passed in bittersweet transition. Ka taught Ayana techniques for preserving food, for treating common injuries, for reading weather patterns. Information passed between sisters with an urgency born from knowing their time together was ending. Boone watched them work side by side, seeing how deeply their bond ran despite the recent strain. In quiet moments, he found himself alone with Ayana. They spoke little, but their comfort with each other grew. A touch on the shoulder as they passed, her hand finding his while they watched the sunset. Small intimacies that promised larger ones to come. But Boone also spent time with Ka, sensing she needed to know he saw her sacrifice. On the 4th evening, he found her checking supplies for her journey. You could stay, he said quietly. Not as my wife, but as family. Ayana would want that. Kaya shook her head. No, that would be torture for all of us. I must build a new life, and I cannot do that in the shadow of what might have been. She looked at him directly. But I need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise you will be gentle with her heart. Ayana acts strong, but she feels everything deeply. The world has been cruel to us. Do not let your home become another place where she learns to guard herself. I promise. Ka nodded, satisfied. Then in a gesture that surprised them both, she stepped forward and embraced him briefly. Thank you for saving us, both of us, even if we cannot both stay. On the morning of the 5th day, they prepared for 2 journeys. Kaya would head west toward territories where Apache were more common, carrying supplies and money Boone insisted she take. Boone and Ayanna would ride to town for the ceremony that would legally bind them. The goodbye between sisters was private, conducted in Apache with tears neither tried to hide. When they finally separated, Ka mounted the horse Boone had given her with the fluid grace that marked all her movements. She looked at Ayanna one last time. "Be happy, sister. That is all I ask. I will try." Ayanna's voice broke. "Will you?" Eventually, Ka managed a small smile, sad but genuine. Then she looked at Boone. "Take care of her, Boone Carter. She's choosing a hard path by staying with you." "I know." With a final nod, Ka turned her horse and rode away, her back straight, her head high. Every inch the warrior she'd always been. They watched until she disappeared over the horizon. Ayanna's hand gripped tightly in Boone's. The town gathered in awkward silence as Boone and Ayanna stood before the traveling preacher. Fletcher and his men watched from the back, their presence more guard than witness. Margaret the widow stood with arms crossed, her disapproval evident, but a few faces showed cautious acceptance, curious about the Apache woman who would become Mrs. Carter. Ayanna wore a simple dress borrowed from a more sympathetic neighbor, her hair braided with small wild flowers she'd gathered that morning. She stood with quiet dignity, her hands steady in Boone's despite the hostile stares. The preacher, an elderly man named Reverend Walsh, spoke the words with professional courtesy, asking neither where she came from nor why Boone had chosen her. "Do you, Boone Carter, take this woman as your lawful wife?" "I do. And do you, Ayanna, take this man as your lawful husband?" "I do." Her voice carried clearly through the small gathering, each word deliberate and sure. "Then by the authority granted to me, I pronounce you husband and wife." Reverend Walsh closed his book. "What has been joined here? Let no man separate." There was no celebration, no well wishes from the crowd. People dispersed quickly, some shaking Boone's hand with meaningful glances that said they hoped he knew what he was doing. Fletcher approached last, studying Ayanna with assessment rather than hostility. "You caused trouble, and he pays the price," Fletcher said bluntly. "You understand?" Ayanna met his eyes without flinching. "I understand. I will bring no trouble to his home or his life." Fletcher grunted, seemingly satisfied, then turned to Boone. "Good luck, Carter. You're going to need it." The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Ayanna sat behind Boone on the horse, her arms around his waist, her cheek resting against his back. He could feel her trembling slightly, the strain of the ceremony finally showing now that they were alone. When they reached home, she dismounted and stood looking at the buildings as if seeing them differently. Now this was no longer temporary shelter. This was her home, the place where she would build whatever life came next. "Are you afraid?" Boone asked, watching her face. "Yes," she admitted. "Not of you, but of failing, of not being enough to justify what you sacrificed." He stepped closer, tilting her chin up gently so she had to meet his eyes. "You didn't ask me to sacrifice anything. I chose this, chose you. Not because you were the easier choice, but because when I imagine tomorrow and the day after, and all the days beyond that, you're the one I see beside me." Tears filled her eyes, but she smiled through them. Ka would have been stronger. Ka is finding her own path. This is ours. He kissed her forehead gently. "And we'll build it together, one day at a time." That night, they sat on the porch as darkness fell, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. The future stretched uncertain before them, full of challenges they couldn't predict. The community's acceptance would come slowly, if at all. There would be hard days when Ayanna missed her sister, when Boone questioned if he'd made the right choice, when the weight of their decision pressed heavy on both their hearts. But there would also be mornings waking beside someone who understood silence and valued gentleness. There would be shared work that built something meaningful. There would be moments of unexpected joy breaking through the difficulty, reminding them why they'd chosen this complicated path. Somewhere to the west, Kaya was making camp under the same stars, alone, but free to forge a new identity unburdened by old pain. Boone hoped she would find peace, perhaps even happiness. He hoped that someday, years from now, the sisters might reunite with the wound of this separation, healed enough that they could remember their bond without the bitterness of what had nearly destroyed it. But tonight he focused on the woman beside him, her breathing slow and steady, her hand clasped in his. One sister had fought for him with strength and partnership. The other had fought with vulnerability and hope. He had chosen hope, knowing it was the harder thing to protect, but also the more necessary thing to nurture. Ayana shifted, looking up at him in the darkness. "Do you have regrets?" "No," he answered honestly. "Do you?" She considered the question, then shook her head. "No, I grieve what Ka and I lost, but I cannot regret what we found. It was enough. Not perfect, not without cost, but enough to build upon." As they sat together under the vast sky, Boone understood that this was what life demanded. Impossible choices made with imperfect information, consequences accepted with as much grace as possible, and the commitment to honor what was chosen by living it fully. Two Apache sisters had fought for him, each in their own way. He could only take one bride home, and now, with that choice made final and binding, all that remained was to prove it had been worth the price all three of them had paid. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where honor and difficult choices shape destinies in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a super chat to help us keep bringing you more powerful stories like these. Your support means everything.